Okay, so first with our posture assessment, we are going to start with the back. I'm going to check and see if her ankles are rolled in or out. Is there any supination or pronation? If I can see toes sticking out on either side, I'm going to look for knee creases, glute creases, any spaces. I'm going to look into the inferior angles of her scapula and on above. So I'm going to start with the feet. Like I said, I'm going to see if her ankles are rolled in or out. There's a slight supination on the right foot, and I think it's more so due to weight bearing. As far as I can't see any toes sticking out from behind, so she's got a pretty straightforward posture. Knee creases are fairly even. Glute creases are fairly equal as well, maybe a little lower on the right side, but I also believe that's due to the weight bearing issue. Moving on up to the spine and scapula. It's got a pretty normal spinal curve, nothing irregular that stands out. It's hard to see probably in the video, but the distance between the spine and the scapula is probably around, say, 2.5 inches on each side. They're fairly even. She has her hands by her sides. Let's see. The gap between her right arm is a little bit farther away. It's a little bit larger than the left side. She's also right-handed, so there's a slight more amount of muscle mass on the right arm, which I believe creates that larger angle. Moving up to the head and neck. If you look from the back view, ears are pretty much level. The right may be a little bit lower, but you can barely tell, so they're fairly even. Go turn towards the. I'm gonna have you put your arms across your chest. Okay. So looking at her plumb line, you can tell she has a pretty regular spinal curve. There's nothing irregular about it. A normal curve. Let's see. Just bear with me for a second. On this one, I'll start with her shoulders and work my way down. If you look, her shoulders do sit a little bit behind the line, her plumb line. And if she'll put her arms down, you can clearly tell that it's her shoulders are a smidge behind, but not anything out of the ordinary. Go ahead and cross your arms again. You do notice that her head and neck sit slightly in front of the plumb line, which I find is normal for a lot of people just because of bad posture or just how, 90% of people I feel like have that. Working on down to the hips. The hips are pretty normal. They follow in suit pretty good with the plumb line, which the point falls around right here. If you look, her hip joint, the bones are right about there. So it follows directly in line. There's nothing. Down onto her knee, same thing. I found that the right knee actually is a little bit more pronated in front of the left, but by a small degree. Also, more muscle mass. It's her dominant leg. But other than that, there's no irregular curves. And on down into the ankle. Both ankles are even. There's, besides that slight heavier weight bearing on the right side, there's no more irregularities. Alright, front face. For front face, I'll start with the feet and work my way up. We'll look at what direction the feet are pointed in. They're fairly straightforward, so there's no pigeon toeing going on. They're not in or out. So straightforward, normal. Rolled in and out. I talked about the supination of the right foot a little bit. It depending on the balance, but for the majority of the time, I'd say around 80% of what I've looked at, it's been supinated to the right side. So I'm saying that she may bear her weight a little heavier on the outside of this foot. Rolled in or out, same thing as a supination. I believe she's just putting more weight on that right foot. As far as her internal hip rotations, they look fairly the same. I don't see any irregularities. I said previously on the lateral view that her right leg actually pronates out a little bit more from her hip, but it's very slightly. It's not an irregular internal rotation. It's just I believe it's mainly due to just muscle mass. Hips are even, both joints straight across. There's not a shift in her pelvis. It's the same straight across. Let's see. And onto the arms, you'll probably be able to see now the gap in the right arm. The angle is slightly bigger. She's a little stiff right now, but you could tell you can see a little bit the angle of degree, or the peephole like they described in the example videos online. It's actually a little larger, but I believe that's also because of the dominant side, because that is the dominant side. Shoulder levels, the right side, this is where you can see a clear difference, and again, dominant side I think has a big effect on this. You can clearly see that the right side has a substantial lift compared to the left side. Clavicle height, she doesn't have very protruding clavicles, but as far as going in and seeing where they're located at, they're very close together and right in, but they're very even. There's no irregularities. They're not sticking out. There's no irregular angle or anything. Let's see. If she turns her neck to the right, you can see even flexion of the muscle. Same thing with the left, even flexion. There's the same activity going on. And one more thing I forgot, if you'll turn to the door. I forgot to mention this with the scapulas. She doesn't have, speaking of angles reminded me, she doesn't have any harsh pointed angles coming out with her scapulas. They're fairly even, not flat, because the scapula is of course going to show, but there's no jagged point where there's, an irregular sharp angle. Alright, that's it. Alright, thank you.